Reports of sexual assault in Chicago appear to be returning to pre-pandemic levels. And in the near North District, which includes River North, cases have reached a 20-year high. This comes from a recent report in the Chicago Sun-Times. Joining us now to discuss the factors behind this increase and ways to address it are Madeleine Bae, a reporter at the Chicago Sun-Times, and Madeleine Bae, Public Policy and Advocacy Manager at the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation. We also invited the Chicago Police Department, but were told that no one was available to join this conversation. Madeleine Bae and Madeleine Bae, thanks to you both for joining us. Madeleine Bae, starting with you, please. You reported that you found sexual assault reports increased in 19 of 22 districts in Chicago compared to 2020, and that the latest data available through December 26 show there were more than 2,000 sexual assault reports in 2021 compared to about 1,600 in the same time period in 2020. Madeleine Bae, what was the cause of this, and how was the end of most COVID closures related?
Well, it's hard to pinpoint exactly why we're seeing this increase in numbers. In talking with advocates and with the Chicago Police Department and other people, it seems like bars and restaurants reopening or just people getting out and not being quarantined, as we saw in 2020, could be partially attributed to it. Could also be that survivors of sexual assaults are feeling more empowered to come forward and report these kinds of crimes, because a lot of times, we're still seeing there is a stigma with being a victim of these crimes and not feeling comfortable or not feeling like if you do come forward that you'll be taken seriously. But now there's great advocacy work out there that's really supporting survivors, coming forward and filing reports.
Madeleine Bae, what's your reaction to this this increase in reported cases? Are you surprised at all?
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to look at Madeleine's report and not be extremely disappointed in seeing those numbers rise. I do think the numbers going up is kind of a multitude of factors that Madeleine had mentioned. COVID-19 pandemic just kind of changing things in general. More survivors interested in reporting, wanting some sort of accountability after experiencing harm. But I think overall it's a whole variety of factors. It's still really disappointing to see the numbers, but at the same time, across the country, we are seeing, an increase in crime correlated with an increase in poverty and hardship that people are facing during the pandemic. And I think Chicago is not alone in that trend that we're seeing across the country.
Madeleine Bae, what would you say were some of the challenges of reporting in this prevalence of sexual assault crimes?
Definitely with getting accurate data and making sure that the numbers are matching up. One thing that makes it really difficult to report on sexual assault is that even if a survivor comes forward, let's say years after the report, that can skew sometimes the numbers and the data that you're seeing. And so just making sure that we're properly understanding where these assaults are happening or where they're getting reported at, and just making sure that we're doing our best job at making sure our information is accurate.
Madeleine Bae, you worked on a report that was published in 2020 that reviewed CPD data from 2010 to 2019, and you found that 80 to 90% of sexual harm reports made to CPD did not result in an arrest. Why do you think that is, and what impact does that have on whether others decide to file reports?
Yeah, I think it's a whole variety of reasons, Brandis. And really, I think it comes down to our society's perpetuation of rape culture and victim blaming. A lot of folks are not coming forward to law enforcement in the first place. So of the 80 to 90% who did report to CPD, that's only, a very small fraction of the people that are experiencing sexual harm, because only a certain kind of minority of folks are going to be going to law enforcement in the first place. But I think oftentimes these kinds of perceptions of what rape is and what sexual harm is impacts all of us. It also impacts law enforcement and their treatment of survivors, their understanding of survivors' experiences, and their willingness to sit down and listen to a survivor's story and not immediately dismiss it out of hand and decide whether to forward that case onto prosecutors.
Madeleine Bae, your reporting, you pointed out that court proceedings, often when they do happen, they can be very long and drawn out. What impact does this have on survivors?
Yeah, it's definitely a very traumatic event that you go through regardless. And then if you do end up going through court, sometimes it can take 2 to 3 years for it to finally, reach a conviction or finish. And that's in part because of the DNA analysis that goes into these kinds of cases. And so it can cause definitely a strain on any kind of survivor that goes through it. The state's attorney office does provide some support to those people. There's also great advocacy work among organizations within the Chicagoland area that provide support, whether that be through therapy or in counseling, that really helps survivors who do have to go through this, because it is a really difficult thing to have go through.
Absolutely. Madeleine Bae, what can be done then to address the prevalence of sexual assault crimes in Chicago?
Absolutely. I mean, the numbers that Madeline reported on in River North and other areas in Chicago, it's very alarming. I also think it's really critical to remember that the numbers are not necessarily the whole story. If we are only focusing on law enforcement response to sexual harm, we are missing the vast majority of survivors who will never go to law enforcement. So we need a really, crisis level, trauma-informed response to survivors who do go to law enforcement. We also need to be investing in community services like rape crisis centers, therapy services, prevention initiatives, and a whole host of other, necessary things that survivors need. Because if we're only focusing on law enforcement, very necessary to focus on that. However, we're missing the vast majority of survivors if we're only focusing on the law enforcement response. It needs to be a quality one, but we also need alternative things going on as well for survivors.
Okay, so speaking of alternatives and talking about prevention instead, Madeleine Kenny, you also reported on what venues, restaurants, bars, what they can be doing to prevent sexual assaults. Tell us a little bit about that before we let you both go.
Yeah, I co-reported this story with Elvia, and basically, it looks at whether or not bar owners, restaurant owners, do they have some type of responsibility when it comes to how they should protect their patrons when they come there, whether it's just making sure that they're trained in recognizing the red flags, or potentially not over-serving customers who are drinking. Because as reported in our story, a lot of these cases do have alcohol or drugs involved, which is not an excuse by any means, but just, it's a variable that needs to be looked at. And so looking at the responsibility, whether or not entertainment district has any kinds of responsibilities in handling this. One survivor we talked to did say that she believes they should look out for the people that come to their establishments.
Enough responsibility to go around. Madeleine Kenny and Madeleine Bae, thanks to you both for joining us.